Welcome back. This is Unit 4 of the GCC Poverty class, looking at the dynamics between richer and poorer countries. So we've talked about poor countries and why they are poor. Now we're going to look at the other side, at the donor countries who provide development assistance to poor countries. We will do this over 2 units. First, we will look at country-to-country assistance, which is the way that aid has traditionally been delivered. And then next week, we will look at new development players operating on other levels, including individuals, foundations, corporations, and microfinance institutions. What is important to note is that currently most aid programs are actually hybrids, stretching across many levels and multiple players. Okay, talking here about country-to-country dynamics, how middle-income and wealthy countries seek to help poor countries. We're talking about government-to-government assistance here, and we often call it foreign aid. The official term is Official Development Assistance, or ODA, and these are public funds in the form of tax dollars from donor country citizens. And foreign aid can be given in 2 ways: bilaterally, from one country to another country directly, or through countries donating money to multilateral institutions who then get the money to poor countries. Some feel that multilateral channels are more effective and efficient in the delivery of public money because they reduce the number of different bilateral players and agendas, and they theoretically direct funds with more potential for impact. Think of the class gift. It is generally better appreciated by you, the teacher, if funds are pooled for a larger, more useful gift than dispersed individually in the form of coffee cups and candy. So, what is aid? Beyond the realm of technical economic definitions and the many ways of parsing the term, aid can be thought of like this. In a high functioning developed country such as the United States, the government exists to provide for the common good and for each individual, whether rich or poor. The list of goods and services provided is astounding. Maintaining roads, running public schools, providing social welfare support and health care to the poor, regulating air traffic, monitoring banking and investment transactions, maintaining quality standards for food, water, drugs, and consumer goods, providing for the public safety, operating the military, putting out fires, preserving natural spaces, and the list goes on and on. Now, some might argue about the government's effectiveness in handling these tasks, or to what extent it should even be involved in such tasks. But the key point is that the government has the capacity to provide such services for its citizens. It's able to do this because it collects tax revenue, makes investments, or borrows money to create a large pool of funds to cover both the routine and emergency costs of running the country. It delivers public goods through a myriad of civil servants, government employees, consultants, and private sector contractors. In addition, in a high-functioning developed country, the private sector, both for-profit and not-for-profit institutions, also provide goods and services. These can include banking, insurance, legal services, medical care, telecommunications, construction, and the procurement and distribution and sale of goods and products of all kinds. By contrast, an extremely impoverished country, that is, a failed or failing state, generally neither has the money nor the capacity to perform these functions. The government cannot provide for the people, and the people cannot provide for themselves through a market system. So, put simply, aid is what is given by outsiders to replace these funds, create this capacity, and deliver these public and private goods. It is designed to meet both people's immediate needs and to provide the conditions for economic growth so that the country can develop the capacity to blend public and private mechanisms for meeting its needs on its own. So, how is aid or official development assistance given from rich countries to poor countries? What forms can it take? A primary one is budget support, which is essentially large transfusions of cash from rich country budgets into poor country budgets, propping up programs that the government in the poor country is already running. Or budget support can also be in the form of loans of varying interest rates. Sometimes wealthier countries will come in and provide directly programs and services in the poorer country. This is opening a health clinic or starting a school. Some countries like to come in and actually build hard infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and sewers. And some like to come in and offer capacity building and training for local talent, providing technical assistance in all kinds of areas. And some like to just provide directly goods and materials. And finally, debt relief is a form of aid that I'll describe in just a minute. But what you need to know is that sometimes it's very hard to categorize what is aid and who it's coming from. So it can be very, very messy, and there's lots of blending of funding streams within these different forms of aid. That most aid outside of budget support and debt relief actually involves a variety of players to get the job done. Partnerships between multiple donors, local government ministries, charities, and other organizations. Very often, a donor country will contract out all of its programming to a nonprofit or charity like Save the Children or Mercy Corps, or sometimes it will involve vendors and companies from the donor country that come in and do the building, or sometimes they will also employ people from the poor country itself. And most programs are actually a blend of all those strategies. Again, very messy. Now, debt relief is a special kind of aid. Debt relief is the cancellation of loan and interest payments owned by poor countries to developed countries from loans made by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and by bilateral donors. Many of these loans are 50, 60 years old. And debt relief is generally granted by much of the OECD donors and by the World Bank and by the IMF in large sums and began back mostly in the 1980s. I would say it's pretty much the least controversial type of aid. But when you look a little deeper, it's also more complicated. I mean, debt relief doesn't really have any opposition. It sounds good and has been embraced by celebrities. And there are few in good conscience that would argue that extremely impoverished countries should be paying interest on loans made to former dictators who are no longer in power, or that poor countries should be paying this debt to rich countries while their populations starve. It speaks to the goal of self-sufficiency by encouraging poor nations to use those funds instead to contribute to their own development. Clearing the books of this debt also lowers the risk rating of the poor countries. And this will qualify them for new loans and also make them more attractive to foreign investors. However, many experts point out that things are rarely so simple. First, most forgiven debts were not actually being serviced anyway, so there's little transfer of real resources to the poor country. To the extent that some countries were servicing this debt, there's also no real guarantee that those newly freed up funds will or can be used effectively for domestic development purposes, and in fact, no way for the international community to even track what happens with that money. Some have pointed out that debt relief programs are inherently unfair because not everyone qualifies. The poorer the country still is, despite the original loan, generally the better chance that the debt will be forgiven. While other countries like Bangladesh and India, whom many agree have put past loans to good use in producing growth, do not qualify for debt relief, and most must continue to service their loans. Others also see debt relief as launching another vicious cycle for poor countries. Bad debt is forgiven so that new debt can be taken on, and this cycle repeats. To make matters worse, in some experts' eyes, debt relief is also often counted as aid in ODA totals, inflating the generosity of a donor country's bottom line without actually costing them a cent. So why do countries give aid? There are many, many reasons. And in reality, any country's decision to give aid will involve several of these motivations at once. First, there's the human dimension, where people believe that it's unethical or immoral to let others suffer without trying to help. But self-interest, in many forms, also motivates donors. Enlightened and not so enlightened self-interest. In a globalized world where people and germs and conflicts easily migrate across borders, someone else's problems can quickly become your problems. So helping to mitigate them before they get to you makes sense. Security concerns are a big driver of foreign aid, especially from the U.S. And a good bit of the aid the U.S. gives is part of fighting the war on global terror, trying to keep states from failing and discouraging the development of non-state rebel groups that tend to thrive where there is no functioning government and where people live in extreme poverty. But this kind of security aid also can end up going to decidedly non poor countries. In fact, some of the biggest recipients of U.S. foreign aid, aid that is categorized as development aid, actually goes to places like Pakistan, Egypt, and Israel. Not where the world's most poor people live, but very strategically important countries for the United States. Commercial motivations also drive donors to give to poor countries. Think of all the potential customers for wealthy country products out there. You'll often hear it said, all those armpits to deodorize. If you want to sell your products in untapped markets, it helps if your government can boost the ability of those consumers to buy your stuff. Political considerations impact donor activity, as leaders of wealthy countries curry favor with voters and interest groups within their own populations by directing foreign aid to pet causes. And finally, political motivations extend to the world stage and to dynamics between countries. Geostrategic motivations for giving foreign aid are everywhere. China has traditionally given aid not only as part of its resource hunts, but also to gain the loyalty of African nations who then reciprocate with diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China, and not Taiwan, as the real China, or by voting with China in international bodies. Similar dynamics are in play around Pakistan and India's rivalry or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Giving money is a way to make friends, and these friends can help you in places where they have a vote, like in the United Nations General Assembly, which is one country, one vote. So who gives aid? Mostly, in the past, it has been what we call traditional bilateral donors. These are the wealthy countries of the world: US, Europe, plus Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And they are all members of what is known as the Operation for Economic Cooperation and Development. These are the OECD countries. And within this block of developed countries, there's something known as the Development Assistance Committee. And this is the group of the wealthiest nations who give aid to poor countries. So when you see OECD, those are the wealthy countries. The OECD DAC are the ones who give most generously. In fact, they really are a club and are often known by the term the Paris Club. Now, motives are different within the Paris Club. The US, as we've said, tends to give motivated by, at least in part, by security concerns. The Swedes will often give out of ideology and a commitment to progressive ideals in their own society. France, in particular, will give typically to promote the Francophone world, to give to countries that were former colonies where French is spoken so they can continue to extend the influence of their language and culture. Japan typically gives in East Asia and motivated sometimes very commercially. Now, there's agreement in the development community that the wealthy countries of the OECD DAC should give a target of 0.7% of their own gross national income to foreign aid for development purposes. That's 0.7%. And as you can see on the image on the left, this shows you what percentage of their own income these countries are giving away as foreign aid. This is how much it hurts. And you can see here that only a few Scandinavian countries, plus the UK, actually make that goal. Now on the right, you can see that the United States is the largest donor by volume. We give away the most dollars, but we're actually at the lower end of the club by percent of gross national income. The US only gives away about 0.2% in foreign aid, well below the target of 0.7%. And you can see in your readings for more detail behind all these numbers. And it's interesting to note that while overall aid levels have risen since the rebounding of the world economy, aid going to least developed countries and sub-Saharan African countries has actually fallen. Now, more recently coming on stage are what are known as non-traditional donors, donors outside the OECD. These countries have started to get in on the aid game because of their own economic growth. They are now on the donor side instead of the recipient side. Many of these have actually been recipients of development aid in the past. And therein, aid tends to look different from the OECD aid, and it's typically given for different reasons. And you have readings on some of these here. India does a lot of giving within its South Asian region, typically to bolster local markets for its products and to counter the weight of its rival Pakistan. Arab states give to help counter terrorist activity, which thrives in failed states, and also to promote Islam on the African continent. Now, China as a donor country is a special case. A lot of attention is focused here now. Because of the growing volume of development aid China now gives, Chinese aid to Africa grew from 210 million in 2000 to 3.7 billion in 2011. But it's also controversial because of the form in which they give aid and why they give it. First, Chinese aid is typically given with few strings attached. The Chinese do not generally require recipient countries to meet any preconditions for aid, like good governance or good human rights records, so they end up giving to some of the world's more unsavory regimes. Critics feel as China is increasingly able to throw its weight around in the world, they should be doing it in a responsible way, and you'll often hear reference to the responsible stakeholder argument. Some believe that the way China gives aid actually undermines some of the aid given by traditional donors, aid that is used to try to promote democracy, promote good human rights records, improve governance, or reduce corruption. For example, the Chinese give to dictators such as Mugabe in Zimbabwe or Bashir in Sudan. China not only gives to countries the West won't give to, it also gives aid and does business with countries laboring under punitive sanctions by the West. Second, Chinese aid is controversial because the Chinese are very much on a resource hunt, desperate for natural resources, which they're quite thin on, and because they have such a large growing population and a growing middle class, which need a whole bunch more resources. So a good deal of Chinese aid is in the form of mining and oil extraction infrastructure, and that aid is often then used to get those resources back to China. The Chinese will come in and build in a place like Angola oil wells and infrastructure to transport the oil and roads and airports for their laborers. Now, along with that, they will build some hospitals and schools, but a big chunk of it is going to hard infrastructure that then benefits the Chinese in getting these resources back to mainland China. Some believe that these resource hunts are contributing to environmental devastation as well, and the fact that aid dollars contribute to that is troubling to some. And finally, when the Chinese government gives a road or a hospital to a country, they exclusively use Chinese contractors who come in and build it instead of using local workers. And these Chinese workers tend to live and work isolated from the local populations, while traditional donors try to use local labor to both create jobs and leave talented, trained capacity in the country where they depart. And again, a lot of these are generalizations, but these are the main points that are often brought up about Chinese aid. So China's a big player in Africa and getting a lot done for the Africans. If you talk to people in Africa, they're quite grateful for the Chinese and the fact that the Chinese are not interfering in their business and how they run their governments. They're in, they're out, they're efficient, they provide things that people need. But China is also benefiting quite a bit from its aid in the form of allies for its foreign policy and resources for its own economy. You'll see a quote in your readings calling Chinese aid benign but not altruistic. And it probably behooves us to remember that traditional Western donors are guilty of a lot of these same sins. So a quick history of aid, just to place it in perspective for you. Development assistance, ODA or aid, was really invented in the Marshall Plan, post-World War II, where the United States gave huge sums of money to rebuild Europe after the devastation of the war. Aid became a strategy used by both the US and the USSR as we came into the years of the Cold War, where poor countries were given assistance and in return they would join the alliance at either pole of that Cold War. Globalization was a bit of a turning point where countries like India that had received development assistance and were poised to take advantage of global markets started to do really, really well. And by the 1990s, you had a real split between those countries that did well in globalization who no longer needed the aid and their economies were growing, and then a whole bunch of countries in the bottom billion who, it became very evident, had not benefited really at all from the decades of aid that they had received during that same time period. $1 trillion over those decades. A lot of people in the 1990s began to realize that there was some reason why it wasn't working in some countries and had worked in others. And so finally, the year 2000, the world development community put together a set of goals that they believed needed to be achieved in order to end poverty in the world. And these were the Millennium Development Goals that were set out in 2000 and are now measured every year up until 2015. The goal was to achieve these goals by 2015 or see significant progress in them. So here are the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and you'll know these very well by the end of this class. And your country has many MDG reports year by year on how they're doing on this scale. So familiarize yourself with these so that we can all speak the same language about what development looks like. That is the lexicon here that the development community is mostly using these days. It's around the MDGs. There are many, many issues, lots of issues around aid. As I had said, when the world came to this turning point after the 1990s, when we began to really realize that some countries had done very, very well with aid and others had done very, very little with aid and had even gone backwards, these issues became more and more controversial as the world really reevaluated what had been going on in the development community. Some believed that not enough aid had been given and the quantity was insufficient. A lot of people believed that the quality was insufficient, that certain kinds of aid programs were destined to work better than others and we weren't funding the right things. People began to look at the issue of conditionality. Were we tying the right strings to aid and were we really holding countries to those conditions? A lot of people began to wonder about the effectiveness of aid in general. And then people began to really, really talk about alternatives to aid. And when you're evaluating aid programs, I think it is important to remember what we talked about motivations. The motivations that prompt the aid in the first place will affect all of these issues here. Okay, so the first debate is that there are those who say there has just not been enough aid given. And economist Jeffrey Sachs leads the camp, believing that if everyone boosted their giving to the recommended 0.7% of GNI, poverty could be eradicated. Beyond boosting numbers, however, others believe that we also need to look at what is getting counted as aid that really has marginal value. Here's where you get things like phantom aid. Phantom aid gets counted in a country's ODA total. So if you're a donor and you're giving any of this kind of aid, you're getting credit for providing development assistance that really doesn't do much for development. Some examples include debt relief on bad debts. We talked about those. That's money that rich countries were not going to be getting anyways after the debt payments had ceased. So relieving those debts doesn't do a lot to transfer resources. Experts would say that reconstruction for wars that we started in places like Iraq and Afghanistan should not be counted as development aid. Refugee services for situations that we helped create should also not be counted as aid. Technical assistance fluff is something that you'll see in aid programming too, where you employ very high-level consultants and academics and experts to weigh in on programming at very high costs, or providing training programs for people in poor countries in fairly random things. Most experts believe that when we send people into dangerous countries to work, that the security that we're providing for ourselves should also not count as aid. And finally, there's a lot of controversy around high administrative overhead. A series of studies by the Brookings Institution and the Center for Global Development a while back concluded that between 50 and 60% of every aid dollar goes to overhead, such as administrative costs, or it stays in the donor country in the form of consultancy and technical assistance by donor country citizens. Now, these figures are hard to come by, and there's a lot of controversy about them because aid can be categorized and counted in so many ways. We can't fully know what is making it to the recipient country. But if only 40 cents of every aid dollar is making it there and being put to work for development, then we have bigger problems than just the amount of money given. On the other hand, it's important to note that overhead is not always indicative of funds misspent. If you believe more aid should reach the people who need it on the ground to fund the things they need in an efficient and cost effective manner, then you must concede that what is needed are good planning mechanisms, good monitoring, oversight, and accountability, and these require administrative overhead. It's complicated. Beyond quantity, there's quality, and the quality and effectiveness of aid depends on many overlapping factors. As we said, the motivations of the donor to start with will dictate very much the quality and effectiveness of programming. Are the donors looking very carefully at the outcomes they're seeking and seeing if these outcomes even make sense or are possible? The characteristics of the recipient pool will very much affect the quality and effectiveness of programming. Local buy-in, political support on the ground for programs is important. The design and the implementation and the evaluation, all of these things are very hard to do. Donor countries need to be looking not only at what they're putting in, but what they're getting out and be able to tweak the various stages of the design process accordingly. It's important that donors coordinate with other donors on the ground so that programs are complementary and not competing. And contingencies on the ground that you can't control. Some of them you can control, some of them you can't, but they're going to affect the quality and effectiveness of aid. So when we're looking at that issue, again, it's more complicated than it might seem. Looking a little bit more deeply at the design of aid programs, one way of distinguishing approaches to the delivery of aid is to consider the manner in which these programs are conceived. Macro or top-down approaches tend to be highly technocratic, designed by development economists based on what former World Bank economist Jeffrey Sachs has called a clinical diagnosis, not unlike that delivered by a physician. Needs are identified and plans are developed, and the poor country receives a comprehensive portfolio of aid in the form of funds, projects, and services delivered by an array of players in the development community. The goal is to jumpstart economies and societies into productivity through structural and policy reforms in concert with massive infusions of cash and programming. Evaluation, monitoring, and mid-course adjustments tend to be the purview of experts and planners located in the donor country or the multilateral institution giving the money. And levels of input and participation from local beneficiaries varies. In contrast, micro or bottom-up approaches are traditionally more modest, incremental, and specialized. They address distinct needs that are to be met by local innovators who are given training and capacity building to solve problems at the grassroots level. William Easterly, another former bank economist who embraces the micro approach, has deemed followers of this approach searchers and derides the proponents of the Jeffrey Sachs macro approach as planners. So searchers versus planners. Among Easterly's concerns with the macro approach is that it seems patronizing to the recipient country. To assume first that external donors and experts can fix the very complicated myriad of structural and logistical problems plaguing a poor country, and then to assume that this can be done in a culturally sensitive and effective way on the ground by technocrats from developed countries. Easterly generally believes that planners overpromise and undeliver, and in the process miss opportunities to empower local reformers and entrepreneurs to design homegrown solutions. By contrast, he believes specialized micro approaches that usually seek to facilitate the workings of the market, not the good intentions of the donor community, are easier to implement, evaluate, and correct. And the debate between the Sachs and Easterly camps has been a long-standing debate, even before Dambisa Moyo entered the picture. In reality, just as private and public sector blurring has become commonplace in aid programs, most large-scale aid projects today actually incorporate both macro and micro elements in their design and implementation. An example of a comprehensive, large-scale, all-inclusive project with both planner and searcher components is the Millennium Villages project. and how these islands of little programming utopias fare in the development world is going to definitely inform the research going forward. Conditionality. There are also hot debates around the issue of conditionality, on the principle of placing conditions on recipient countries in order for them to qualify for aid. And we've already talked about this a little bit with respect to the Chinese, who generally do not require any type of conditions about the situation on the ground or the health of the government before they give the aid. And this is quite controversial. Is conditionality on this level good or bad? This is the question. And the answer always is that it depends. Requiring that recipient countries adopt basic best or even good practices in governance, transparency, and accountability has been proven to dramatically increase these governments' abilities to absorb and effectively use aid resources. Numerous studies reveal what is not surprising. The better the infrastructure on the ground, the better the results. The conundrum here, however, and it is one pointed out by many experts in the field, is that if all aid were premised on such conditions of good governance and transparency, no aid would be given to the countries that need it the most, those that are badly governed, corrupt, or lacking infrastructure. So that's an interesting one to consider as we go forward. OECD countries have typically used conditionality, and as we've mentioned, many of the new non-traditional donors do not. Structural adjustment is a special kind of conditionality that was used during the 50s and 60s, where donors held funds out as a carrot for poor African countries mostly to pretty much completely upend their economic system and to privatize a lot of what had become nationalized during the time that a lot of those countries flirted with the notion of socialism. So it was a way of forcing more of a private market-based approach on economies in order to qualify for aid. And tied aid is another type of aid that we've already talked about a little bit, again, with respect to the Chinese, where the Chinese bring in their own companies and their own laborers to actually build the projects their aid dollars are paying for. Well, the Chinese are not alone. The U.S. also is very much of a provider of tied aid, especially around food aid and anti-hunger programs. Now, this whole system is in reform right now, but for most of the time that the U.S. has been giving food aid internationally, it has been required that all the food be grown by American farmers, shipped on American ships, and delivered by USAID personnel. And that's USAID is the United States Agency for International Development. So parts of that are now being reformed, but it's interesting to note that the U.S. has very much been a purveyor of tied aid as well, aid that also benefits our own citizens. So questions of aid effectiveness are throughout the readings and the videos that you'll be doing, and you'll see that this gets very contentious. People get very ornery about this issue. And a couple things I want you to remember as you're digesting all of this is that we have some fundamental problems at the heart of this debate, which is how do we measure and define effectiveness? Very elusive and defined differently by different people. So these debates can very often get quite murky when you're not even really sure how you're measuring and defining that which you are fighting over. Another problematic aspect of the aid effectiveness debate is that we're not only looking at effectiveness and ineffectiveness, but there's also an argument to be made that we need to be looking for harm, that some aid programs have worked, some haven't, and it can be said that some have actually created harm in the form of unintended consequences. So again, very, very complicated at many different layers, and you will be diving into that. And as you do so, I want you just to think just briefly about what it would mean to get rid of country-to-country aid, official development assistance. What if we did away with the whole foreign aid regime and instead turn to a model of self sufficiency for poor countries, which is what a lot of aid critics advocate. And you'll see that especially in the Dambisa Moyo sections of your videos. Self sufficiency generally has come to mean in country reforms and increased economic activity, poor countries banding together in blocs and regional cooperatives, and private sector solutions. And as I said, we'll be tackling this in our synchronous session, but I want you to also keep in mind what you've learned about the scale of the problems that are facing poor countries and mull over how likely it is, in your opinion, that poor countries can do without aid, that there are alternatives that can completely replace it. And then I want you to also just think one systems level higher here. And many would say this is where there is a definite elephant in the room. And they would say that the $1 trillion in aid that has been donated and spent over the last decades is somewhat beside the point. The real solution lies, perhaps, in changing the rules of the entire game, but remembering that these rules serve to support the status quo and to benefit the wealthy countries who are the donor countries. So some would say if wealthy countries are really serious about poverty eradication, they need to do much more than give aid. They need to play more responsibly on the global stage and within global systems to even out the playing field, a playing field whose uneven nature has benefited them. And some examples of systems level reforms that are way beyond aid include reforming trade rules and regimes, things that govern tariffs and subsidies and the way that goods move to markets around the world and who can participate in global markets and on what terms. It means possibly tweaking the whole global financial architecture to change the way money moves and investments get made around the world. It may mean changing immigration policies so that more people from poor countries can work in wealthier countries where there are opportunities so that money can be sent back home to their countries of origin. It may mean putting boots on the ground, peacekeeping and conflict prevention strategies to keep poor countries from entering the doom spiral of war, which, if you'll remember, Paul Collier calls that development in reverse. And it may mean getting really serious about climate change mitigation, recognizing that a hotter, drier world is going to be much harder on poor countries. So just things to mull over whether you think that these systems level reforms are what is required and where they would fit into this whole debate. So that's it. Pretty much all you need to know to dive into the rancor and the layers around country to country aid, foreign aid. Now, next week, we will be tackling a whole nother part of the development ecosystem, which are new players and new tools beyond the country to country dynamics we've been discussing. And these include individuals and corporations, microfinance institutions, and entrepreneurs of all kinds. So that'll be our next task ahead of you. But before that, I will see you in the synchronous session where we can continue to wrangle some of these ideas around aid. All right, have a good week.